Becoming a widow alters you in unexpected ways, and one such shift led me to remain on the land that Glenn and I had developed together in the countryside of Montana. He'd died 2 winters prior to that evening. Sometime between his burial and my 43rd birthday, I persuaded myself that it was logical to stay put. The nearest neighbors, the Farley clan, were roughly 3 miles away along the county road, while the closest sheriff's outpost sat in Ridgefield, a solid 50-minute haul over paths that grew hazardous once night fell. Urban folks often imagine solitude as serene, even idyllic. Yet there's zero allure in being a solitary woman in a home encircled by vast wheat expanses and an all-encompassing blackness extending endlessly outward. On that specific early November night in 2017, I'd retired around 10 o'clock, worn out from chopping logs and repairing a stretch of fencing toppled by the gusts. My pair of dogs, a German shepherd called Duke and a mixed breed named Copper, curled up in their customary places near the wood-burning stove. The breeze had calmed, leaving the dwelling wrapped in that profound, enveloping silence found only far from any settlement. I stirred awake to Duke's deep, rumbling snarl, the sort he reserved for true threats. My gaze met utter blackness, and briefly I remained motionless, straining to distinguish actual noises from echoes of my fading dream. Soon Copper chimed in. Now both hounds pressed against the bedroom glass, their forms tense and fur bristled in outlines against the subtle moon glow filtering past the drapes. That's when I caught it, far off yet distinct. Other canines yapping amid the nocturnal gloom. The Farleys owned hounds, and those didn't sound like this unless something had alarmed them. I propped myself up on one arm, groping for the bedside light, but then spotted it. A beam of headlights gliding gradually over my eastern pasture. Not along the roadway, but right through the field itself, traversing the leftover wheat remnants. My pulse quickened as I observed the beams advance with intent, precise, as if the driver was intimately familiar with the route. No one ought to be trespassing on my grounds at that hour. I glanced at the timepiece, 2:47 a.m. I skipped the light switch. Some deep-seated urge, raw and instinctive, urged me to remain shadowed. Instead, I eased from the sheets and hunkered beneath the pane, lifting my head just high enough to observe. The lights had halted, stationary by the property's boundary close to the aged grain silo Glenn had never demolished. Then they extinguished. For what felt like an eternity, stillness reigned, save for the dogs' persistent growls and the faint, frantic chorus from the Farley hounds. Next, another pair of headlights emerged, approaching from the west via the disused logging trail that pierced the woods. These two progressed cautiously, purposefully, halting at the edge of my land before vanishing. My throat tightened. I fumbled for the cell on the nightstand, locating it amid the shadows, and hit the activation key. The display illuminated, which I swiftly lowered, blocking the light with my frame. 0 bars. Reception was always spotty here, though occasionally I'd snag a single bar by the kitchen sill. I navigated the home in pitch black, the dogs trailing me closely, their claws tapping lightly on the wooden planks. In the kitchen, I flattened against the wall next to the front-facing window, which overlooked the expansive gravel drive linking my place to the main road. The sight there nearly buckled my knees. A third rig idled at the driveway's terminus, its beams doused, merely a shadowy bulk against the marginally brighter night sky. They'd boxed in the residence, 3 autos stationed at separate vantage points, each arriving with pinpoint accuracy, evading detection from the thoroughfare. I lifted the phone once more toward the glass, scanning urgently for any signal flicker. Zilch. My mind flashed to the landline in the den, that vintage rotary model Glenn had clung to, given the phone service woes. I crept in that direction, bent low, but a noise froze me. The sharp static of a radio crackling outdoors, trailed by a male voice, too soft to discern the content, yet near enough to catch its timbre. I inched to the den on hands and knees, my joints grating over the carpet that Glenn's mom had gifted us for our nuptials. The old rotary phone rested on the end table next to the sofa, and I picked up the handset as silently as possible, holding it against my ear. Nothing but utter quiet, no dial tone, no sound at all. They'd severed the connection. This wasn't the work of rowdy kids out for a thrill or confused outdoorsmen who'd wandered off track. No, these intruders had come prepared, aware that disabling the phone would trap me here, calculating that by the time help noticed my absence, it would already be over. I replaced the receiver and leaned against the couch, forcing my mind to focus. In the bedroom closet sat Glenn's 12-gauge Remington shotgun, the one he'd shown me how to handle against the coyotes that preyed on our chickens. I hadn't touched it since his passing, but I remembered it was chambered and ready, with a box of shells stored on the shelf above. Somehow, I had to slip back to the bedroom unseen past the windows. Duke erupted with a sudden piercing bark, and I seized his collar, yanking him tight against me while murmuring for silence. From the living room window, a flashlight beam swept over the front porch. Out there, just beyond the entrance, perhaps 15 feet from my shadowed hiding spot, someone prowled my porch. Footsteps echoed on the porch planks, measured and purposeful, and the beam lingered at the glass. I flattened myself to the floor, cheek pressed to the chilly hardwood, gripping both dogs' collars as they quivered and rumbled low. The light traced the room overhead, highlighting the sofa, the bookcase, the mantel where our wedding picture remained on display. Then it snapped off, and the steps pulled away, accompanied once more by that static radio hiss. A deeper voice replied with words I couldn't make out. They were relaying locations, synchronizing their approach, all with a chilling professional poise that unnerved me beyond words. Only after the sounds receded did I begin inching toward the hallway leading to the bedroom. Each groan of the floorboards rang out like thunder, and I braced for the crash of breaking glass or a door flying open. At last, in the bedroom, I nudged the closet door ajar and groped through the dark until my hand wrapped around the shotgun's icy barrel. I drew it free, verified it was loaded by feel, and snatched the shell box from the upper shelf. My fingers shook as I stuffed spare rounds into the pockets of my pajama bottoms. Beyond that, I had no strategy, just dread of facing several equipped assailants who obviously knew their business. Hiding crossed my mind, maybe sliding under the bed or barricading in the bathroom, but I realized it would only postpone the inevitable. These intruders hadn't orchestrated all this for nothing. They sought something specific, and in this place, the only prize worth taking was me. A noise from the rear of the house sent Duke surging ahead, baying wildly. This time I couldn't restrain him. He tore off down the hall to the kitchen, Copper racing after. The back door shuddered in its frame. Someone was prying it loose. I dashed after the dogs, shotgun leveled, my bare soles pounding the floor. In the kitchen, the door bucked under repeated heavy impacts from outside. The deadbolt held firm, but the aged wood had weakened from years of harsh Montana freezes. It wouldn't last. I pointed the barrel at the door's middle and yelled at full volume that I was armed and ready to fire on anyone who entered. The assault halted briefly. Silence fell, broken by the radio's crackle. Then came a voice I'll carry in my memory forever, composed, even faintly mocking. She's in the kitchen, packing a 12-gauge, likely the husband's old Remington. They knew Glenn, they knew the weapon. A surge of sickness washed over me, nearly buckling my knees. These weren't random opportunists stumbling upon my home. They'd observed me, analyzed me, mapped my habits and weak points. Memories flooded in, trips to town for supplies, chats at the feed store or gas pump where I'd casually shared that I was on my own now, that Glenn had passed, that the ranch felt overwhelming for one but too cherished to sell. I'd laid out my life to acquaintances without a second thought. The voice outside addressed me directly once more. Mrs. Hartley, we're aware you're by yourself. The closest deputy's a solid 47 minutes out, even in clear weather, and the roads are slick with ice. Your cell has no signal here. We've handled situations like this many times, and it's always smoother when folks work with us. His offhand manner of rattling off those details, as if ticking items off a list, hit me hard. It showed just how meticulously they'd orchestrated the whole thing. They'd likely surveilled the place for weeks, or even months, tracking my bedtime, my wake-up routine, the lights I switched on and off. I retreated from the door, shotgun still gripped high, my thoughts scrambling over escape routes that all felt futile. The windows were flimsy single-pane affairs, simple to smash. The doors held up, but their frames were rotted and brittle. Firing at one intruder wouldn't stop the rest. They'd swarm the house before I could chamber another round. That's when it clicked. The root cellar. Glenn had excavated it single-handedly in our second year here. A buried chamber under the kitchen reached via a trap door concealed beneath the rug near the pantry. He'd fitted it with a sturdy steel door at the stairwell's base, always fretting over tornadoes despite how uncommon they were up north. Inside were provisions, preserved foods, drinking water, a radio on batteries, and crucially, a lock operable solely from within. If I could hustle down there with the dogs, I could hunker until they gave up. Sooner or later, folks would spot my absence. Aid would arrive. It wasn't ideal, but it was my sole shot, and time was slipping fast. I darted over, yanking the rug aside one-handed while steadying the shotgun with the other. The trap door sat exactly as before, its iron ring icy in my grasp. I hauled it up and whistled sharply. Duke caught on right away, leaping down the wooden steps into the pitch black. Copper dithered, bewildered, so I seized his collar and half-dragged him in. I was midway down the stairs when shattering glass echoed from inside, chased by thudding boots and shouts exchanged between them. They'd breached. I slammed the trapdoor overhead, groping blindly for the steel door below. My hands latched onto the lever, yanking it shut right as steps pounded in the kitchen overhead. The deadbolt was a beefy commercial-grade one, clanging home with a resonant thud that reverberated through the dim concrete space. I leaned into the chill wall, dogs clustering at my feet, straining to catch the chaos upstairs, cabinets crashing open, furniture toppling, then boots right over the hatch, someone tugging at the ring. That same steady voice from earlier filtered through the floorboards. "Mrs. Hartley, that's an ancient door. We've got tools. We've got patience. Up to you." I stayed silent. In the gloom, I leveled the shotgun at the steel barrier. My dogs leaned into me and I held my breath. Drilling buzzed, then prying noises, metal grinding on metal. It dragged on for what seemed eternal, though likely just 40 minutes. Abruptly, it ceased. Urgent voices bickered now, the composure shattered. An engine roared to life outside, followed by a second. Faint through the thick walls came the crunch of tires on gravel, speeding off into the distance. I didn't budge until faint daylight seeped through the ceiling's narrow vent. Emerging at last, I found the house in ruins. Drawers gutted, closets pillaged, furniture smashed and scattered. But I'd survived. The sheriff discovered me on the porch, shotgun draped over my knees, and I recounted it all. His face was inscrutable as he nodded, then mentioned 3 similar break-ins in the county across the last 2 years, all at remote homes, all single women. 2 vanished without trace. The culprits were never apprehended. 6 weeks on, I offloaded the land and relocated to Bosezaman, where neighbors' homes peer right from my kitchen view. Nights still fragment. I jolt awake at 2:47 a.m., ears pricked for far-off dog barks, braced for headlights cutting across a vanished field beyond my pain. Ridgefield, Montana doesn't grace many maps. A scattering of 20-odd souls, fluctuating with departures or deaths that year. My pal Haley and I shipped out there each summer to bunk with my grandparents while Mom and Dad toiled away. By 6th grade wrap-up, we'd memorized that dirt track to Perkins' General Store better than our own yards. 4 miles of hard-packed soil slicing past wheat expanses and forsaken fields, dotted only by fence stakes and the odd corroded tractor amid the boundless amber vista. We'd trekked it countless times. No trouble ever. A pair of hyper 12-year-olds bursting with energy but lacking any real oversight were out foraging for wild blackberries and dashing toward the dilapidated Jennings barn, which loomed halfway along the path. Our grandparents had zero concerns about us venturing there by ourselves, music, since Ridgefield was the epitome of uneventful calm. The security of seclusion, and the reassurance of recognizing every local face. That Thursday, in early June, Grandma slipped a $20 bill into my hand along with her shopping list, and Haley and I headed out just like we'd done countless times. The instant we left the porch, the intense Montana summer warmth enveloped us music. That arid kind that warps the air over the pavement into a hazy illusion. Haley griped about the dirt sneaking into her sandals, while I pointed out she should have chosen sneakers like mine, and we squabbled over trivial stuff as we strolled along. We'd covered about 2 miles when the sound of an engine caught my ear from behind. Nothing unusual at first, given how often farmers use that route. Yet this one eased to a crawl, prompting me to glance back. A dark green pickup, its front bumper battered and wheel wells caked in mud, eased up beside us, matching our pace. The driver stretched over the empty passenger side and cranked down the window, giving me my initial full view of him. His sparse blonde hair was combed flat against his head with some oily substance. His pale blue eyes bulged unnaturally in his features. Music, paired with a grin that bared all his stained yellow teeth. His words emerged, music in a cozy, approachable tone, the sort grown-ups adopt to win kids over fast. "You two must be the Whitaker granddaughters," he remarked with a knowing nod. "Off to Perkins, right? Your grandma probably sent you for supplies." A brief sense of ease washed over me then. Music, since he recognized our last name, confirming he was from around here. Harmless, familiar. Haley eased up next to me as well, her tense shoulders slumping. He kept chatting, mentioning he toiled on a distant farm beyond the county boundary and swung through Ridgefield now and then for essentials. He introduced himself as Gene. Music. Or was it Dean? Some basic, forgettable name that's blurred now, overshadowed by the horrors that followed and wiped out those minor bits. But his next words stuck sharp as he leaned closer to the window with that eerie, expansive smile fixed in place. He warned of coyote assaults further along the road, claiming a rabid pack had targeted some dogs the day before, making it risky for a couple of young girls to wander unescorted. Haley shot me a doubtful glance, clearly weighing his tale. Coyote issues weren't rare out there, music, and Grandpa had cautioned us about them plenty, even keeping a shotgun handy by the door for such threats. So it rang true, and he clearly counted on that. He suggested giving us a lift to the store, insisting it'd be quick and he was going that way regardless. I paused, a vague weight pressing on my chest without reason, a gut instinct I couldn't pin down. Still, with Haley already stepping toward the truck, I didn't want to come off as a timid child, so I followed her into the cab, perching on the worn leather seat that reeked of smoke and an odd, acrid tang I couldn't place. He merged back onto the road, and briefly, it felt ordinary, the motor's hum and dust clouding up behind via the back glass. Then it dawned on me. We weren't on the correct route. The path to Perkins stretched straight for 2 more miles, then bent east into the town square music. Instead, he'd veered left onto a tight lane, cutting into the neglected Jennings land. I'd roamed its borders often with Haley, challenging each other to approach the crumbling barn and its hollow, staring window voids. The truck jolted across dips and craters as the primary route vanished amid high, untamed weeds. My pulse hammered fiercely, rising into my throat. I questioned our destination, forcing calm into my tone, and he claimed it was a quicker route to the store, a blatant falsehood I recognized as this trail only plunged into forsaken fields. Haley clutched my hand hard, her grip damp with perspiration. I gazed into her expression and caught my own terror mirrored there. Her eyes stretched wide and her mouth clamped into a narrow seam. The guy continued chatting in his relentlessly upbeat voice, rambling on about the climate and the grain crops and irrelevant nonsense, stuffing the space with chatter to keep our minds occupied. But my thoughts were racing, fixated on the fact that no one had a clue about our location. Our grandparents figured we'd be out for a minimum of 2 hours. So if we vanished amid these vast fields, searches wouldn't kick off until midday. The vehicle eased to a crawl near the dilapidated Jennings barn, and I noticed recent activity. New tire marks etched in the dirt, plus a gleaming replacement for the door's padlock. He braked the truck fully and killed the ignition. In the abrupt quiet, distant birdsong reached my ears, along with the faint clicks from the engine as it cooled. He swiveled toward us, flashing that ghastly grin once more. He suggested we hang tight for a moment while he inspected something within the structure. That's the instant Haley let out her cry. It wasn't a plea or a shout, just a primal, gut-wrenching wail of horror that triggered a surge in us both. She jerked the handle and hurled herself from the cab before I could process it. I bolted after her an instant afterward, my soles slamming the earth with such force that agony shot through my ankles. The man bellowed something in pursuit, his affable tone twisting into a harsh snarl, but I didn't glance back to check if he was gaining. We plunged into the towering weeds, forcing our way past stems that lashed our cheeks and limbs, our breathing harsh and uneven. I heard Haley crashing nearby on my left, so I veered in the direction of her pounding steps. The foliage rose so densely that visibility dropped to mere feet ahead, and I braced for a grip on my limb or locks any second. My chest seared and my thighs throbbed, yet I refused to ease up. There was no option, with a stranger who dragged us to this remote, forsaken outbuilding lurking in our wake, and I grasped exactly the peril that implied. We kept fleeing until the undergrowth sparse out into a tilled expanse, the soil yielding and bumpy underfoot. I tripped 2 times, breaking my fall with outstretched palms that shredded against stones and powdery soil. Haley was sobbing openly by then, wrenching gasps she couldn't suppress. I seized her arm and tugged her forward since pausing wasn't possible. Far off, a homestead came into view, topped by scarlet shingles and crowned with a rooster weather vane. I gestured at it and urged Haley onward. Tremors racked my entire frame, not merely my fingers, but my knees, my chin, and a profound quiver in my core that defied any effort to steady. We traversed what seemed like endless stretches of bare farmland, out in the open and defenseless beneath the vivid azure heavens, until we stumbled upon the house. I hammered on the entrance with clenched fists. An elderly lady in her 60s swung it open, a bloom pinned to her smock and bewilderment etched on her features. I attempted to recount the ordeal, but my account tumbled out in frantic, tangled bursts, and it was clear she struggled to follow. She introduced herself as Loretta Grimes and guided us to her kitchen counter, offering cups of water as she dialed our grandparents. Haley wouldn't quit weeping, her form quaking with deep, convulsive heaves. I clasped her fingers over the surface as I fielded Loretta's inquiries. I described the fellow in the emerald pickup, the false tale of prowling coyotes, the detour down the back path, and the outbuilding's updated lock. As I detailed it, Loretta's complexion drained of color, and she reached for the receiver once more to contact the law enforcement in the adjacent settlement. My grandfather pulled up 20 minutes on, his countenance twisted in an unfamiliar blend of dread and rage, enfolding us in an embrace so fierce it constricted my breath. A sheriff's officer arrived an hour beyond that, a youthful fellow with a stenographer's pad who jotted my every detail and inclined his head gravely, though he appeared far from urgent. He explained the profile fit numerous vehicles around the area and that absent a registration tag, options were limited. My grandmother repeatedly murmured that we ought never to have ventured solo, blaming herself for the errand, and the remorse in her tone stung worse than the day's horrors. The ensuing weeks unfolded oddly and tensely, beyond my anticipations. Gossip raced through Ridgefield at its typical small-town clip, yet the responses diverged from what I'd imagined. Certain folks accepted our story outright and commended our quick instincts in fleeing. However, some folks, even those I'd known since childhood, claimed we'd gotten it all wrong. Perhaps the guy was genuinely just offering assistance. They pointed out, quote 2, an elderly gentleman at the local shop even informed my grandfather that urban youngsters like us tended to be overly wary and theatrical, and we'd likely terrified a well-meaning helper by leaping from his vehicle in such a frenzy. That skepticism stung nearly as deeply as the recollection of the incident itself. Haley and I quit discussing the ordeal altogether as it felt like no one cared to listen. We wrapped up the summer at our grandparents' place, but from then on, we avoided solo trips to the store. We steered clear of the abandoned Jennings land entirely, and every evening, we shared a bed since the darkness felt unbearable alone. 6 weeks following that fateful Thursday dawn, my mom phoned with tidings that left her words quivering over the line. Authorities in Carroll County, roughly 80 miles south of Ridgefield, had apprehended a suspect after he tried luring a 9-year-old lad into his car near a fuel stop. The child's dad had stepped inside to settle the bill and emerged right as the attempt unfolded, pinning the perpetrator until officers showed up. The ride in question, a murky green pickup bearing a crumpled front fender. Upon raiding the suspect's residence, a leased mobile home at the fringe of a faded rural enclave, detectives uncovered items my mother refused to detail, despite my repeated pleas. All she revealed was that he'd pulled similar stunts in various counties across different states, with certain victims vanishing without a trace. Perched on my bed's rim back in my old bedroom, receiver tight to my cheek, my mind drifted to that outbuilding secured with its gleaming new latch and the recent wheel marks etched in the dirt. I reflected on how narrowly we'd dodged becoming characters in a far grimmer tale, one potentially concluding with our images pinned to posters on poles statewide in Montana. These days, Haley and I are grown, each raising our own households, and we've revisited that episode only a few times over the decades, though it crosses my thoughts far more than I'd prefer. It surfaces especially when watching my girl stroll back from class or pedal through our streets. From a young age, I instilled in her the perils of unfamiliar faces, vehicles, and the deceptions predators spin, stressing that self-preservation trumps courtesy every time. She's learned to bolt if instincts scream danger, justifying afterward, and that I'll trust her account unconditionally, regardless of outsiders' opinions. The driver of that emerald truck now faces concurrent life terms, confined where he poses no further threat. Yet on restless nights when rest evades me, his features still materialize through the lowered glass. Those jaundiced teeth bared in that eerie, exaggerated grin, that affable tone inquiring whether we were the Whitaker grandchildren bound for the market. And I ponder how many more youngsters encountered that identical pitch, that same leer, without the fortune or swiftness to vanish into the overgrown weeds in time. My relative lined up the position for me at the silo complex just outside Harlow County, some 40 minutes from the closest settlement boasting a traffic signal. He was employed by the AG firm that ran the site and mentioned they required temporary coverage for evenings while their usual staff mended from spinal procedure. Straightforward duties, he assured me. Patrol the boundaries 2 times per shift, record incoming haulers, monitor the heat levels in the holding units, and ensure no intruders were tampering with the grounds. Compensation was solid for essentially hunkering in a compact mobile unit and flipping through books through the wee hours. I'd recently wrapped my educator training and was pending confirmation on my autumn placement from the local education board, making the schedule convenient. My partner figured I was nuts for committing to such isolation. Yet finances were tight, and a month and a half of graveyard hours struck me as straightforward income. The setup occupied around 15 acres of level terrain, hemmed in by maize plots on 3 flanks and a rural lane on the other. It featured 6 towering grain towers, an extended steel shed for gear, and a trio of auxiliary compartments for excess yields in peak times. The modular hut I mostly occupied stood by the entrance barrier, positioned so road lamps were visible from a full mile off. My initial trio of evenings matched his rundown to a T, tediously uneventful in the most welcome sense. I'd circle at the stroke of 12 and once more at 4 a.m. I jotted down a bunch of meaningless entries in the logbook and passed the rest of my shift marking up the practice quizzes I'd prepared for the course I was set to teach come September. My sole companions were the security cameras, 8 in all, streaming fuzzy black and white images to a monitor straight out of the 1990s. It took a bit to adjust to the eerie noises outside at night. The grain shifting inside the silos produced these low, rumbling groans, while the wind sweeping over the fields made the warehouse's metal panels clatter wildly. On my 4th night, that's when I spotted the initial sign that something was off. While making my midnight patrol, I passed by Storage Bay 2, a compact area for gear and replacement parts, and noticed new tire marks in the gravel right up to the roll-up door. That door was meant to remain secured, and per the schedule from my cousin, no shipments were due until the next Tuesday. I inspected the lock and found it intact. So I assumed perhaps a day shift worker had parked there earlier and I'd overlooked the tracks. Still, I noted it in the logbook as required and wrapped up my rounds without dwelling on it. But at 4 a.m. on my next pass, I saw something more unsettling. A dark smudge marred the concrete slab just beyond the bay door, about 2 feet across, as if someone had spilled a substance and attempted to rinse it off. The borders were still damp. I knelt and dabbed it with my finger, which picked up a subtle pink hue, thinned out, like it had been sprayed with water but not fully erased. I lingered there, searching for a logical reason. Perhaps a daytime employee had nicked himself and tidied up. Or maybe a driver had struck a deer on the access road and stopped to inspect their vehicle. I nearly talked myself into dismissing it, yet a nagging doubt persisted. Who cleans up a spill at a grain site during the dead of night? I snapped a few photos on my phone for safety and headed back to the trailer. I considered phoning my cousin, but with the clock nearing 5 a.m., I hated disturbing him over what was likely trivial. Throughout the final hours of that shift, I kept reviewing those photos, magnifying them in hopes of uncovering some clue in the details. When the day supervisor arrived at 6 to take over, I brought up the tire marks and the blemish. He was an older fellow called Dwight, who'd been on site for 15 years, and he merely shrugged it off as probably hydraulic fluid from a tractor. He showed no worry whatsoever, so I dropped it. Even so, I kept the images. 2 nights afterward, I discovered the tools. During my 4 a.m. check along the warehouse's rear where the cameras couldn't capture anything, I encountered a blind spot, roughly 60 feet between the structure and the perimeter fence that no one had wired up. I nearly stumbled over a canvas sack tucked in the grass by the runoff ditch. It weighed a ton, and inside were bolt cutters, a pry bar, a roll of duct tape, and a pack of latex gloves. None of it was from the facility's stock. I'd familiarized myself with every item during orientation, and this gear wasn't listed anywhere. The bolt cutters even had tags from an unfamiliar hardware shop. I gripped the bag, pulse racing, struggling to process what I'd uncovered. A voice in my head wanted to chalk it up to junk that drifted in or was tossed by prankster teens. But tools like bolt cutters and duct tape don't show up together by coincidence. I repacked it precisely as it was, memorized the location, and hurried to the trailer, resisting the urge to sprint. That morning, once my shift concluded, I rang my cousin and laid it all out: the tracks, the mark, the tool stash. He fell silent for an extended stretch, which wasn't his usual way. At last, he advised me to lay low and avoid breathing a word to Dwight or anybody else there. He'd reach out to contacts and sort it, he said, but until then, stick to duties and remain in the trailer whenever feasible. That guidance unsettled me. I pressed him on his suspicions, and he mentioned a few storage bays were rented to outside groups, and he wasn't always clued in on their purposes. His tone suggested he was holding back details. I got hardly any rest that day, sprawled on my apartment bed, fixating on the plaster above, cycling through grim possibilities: drug caches, pilfered goods. I even pondered human trafficking. It felt way too drastic, almost like a scene straight out of some gritty doc. By the time I headed back to the plant that night for my shift, I'd nearly convinced myself to just walk away from the job. But the cash was essential, and I kept repeating that I was likely blowing a string of random events out of proportion. Everything shifted that evening. I arrived at the site near 9, as per routine, and Dwight passed over the keys with barely a word. He looked worn out and unfocused, departing faster than he normally did. I got comfortable in the trailer, brewed a cup of coffee, and dove into reviewing my teaching materials. Just past 11, the security feed caught my eye. Headlights approaching along the rear access path, not the usual route from the county highway where shipments rolled in. That path was meant to stay secured behind a gate, reserved strictly for harvest time when heavy machinery required it. The vehicle swung behind Storage Bay 2, right where those tire marks had caught my attention before. It idled there for roughly 10 minutes, lights dimmed, before retreating the way it arrived. From what the camera showed, nobody stepped out. No one swung by the trailer or signed in with me. Every rule I'd been briefed on demanded that nighttime visitors on the grounds report to the security guard. That was basically the whole point of my role. I jotted the timestamp and a quick sketch of the rig. A white extended cab truck, plates obscured by the viewpoint. I lingered there debating whether to investigate the bay or act like I'd missed the whole thing. After nearly an hour of building up courage, I finally stepped outside. The evening air hung warm and motionless, unusually calm, without a breeze, amplifying the quiet. Armed with my flashlight, I circled the long route, hugging the silos for cover in case I needed to vanish quickly. Reaching Bay 2, I spotted the change right away. The padlock was swapped out. The previous one was a tarnished brass relic, battered from decades of handling. This replacement gleamed silver, fresh off the shelf, with a black rubber sleeve on the hasp. Clearly, someone had upgraded the security. I pressed my ear to the overhead door. Yeah, it was a ridiculous move, straight out of a thriller flick, but options were slim. At first, only the faint creaks of cooling steel from the sun's warmth. Then came a chill that froze me solid. Faint voices, indistinct and garbled, but unmistakably people talking from within, followed by a noise etched forever in my memory, a brief, piercing yelp that halted abruptly as if pain had struck and been swiftly muffled. I stumbled back from that entrance, nearly tripping in my haste. My thoughts spun wildly, grasping for alternatives to what it resembled. Maybe a stray critter or static from a broadcast, anything innocent. I bolted to the trailer in a blur, bolted the door, and froze before the screens, gripping my cell. Looking back, dialing 911 should have been immediate. But my cousin's warnings echoed. Stay low-key. Remember those rented-out bays from outsiders. Suppose I jumped to conclusions. Suppose authorities showed up and it was a false alarm, costing me my gig, dragging him down too, and painting me as a jumpy fool. I stewed there for at least 20 minutes, locked in internal debate, when fresh activity flickered on the display. A figure striding my way, a lanky guy in shadowy attire emerging from Bay 2's vicinity. He moved steadily, without haste or stealth, as if the grounds were his domain at this late hour. I tracked his approach on the feed until he slipped beyond the lens. Gravel crunched under boots right outside. 3 measured raps on the door. I stayed put, silent, scarcely inhaling. Peering through the narrow pane beside it, I made out his silhouette, patient and poised. Then his voice cut through, steady and almost cordial. He acknowledged my presence inside and insisted on discussing the oddities I'd spotted lately. He phrased it to show he was fully informed. The snapshots I'd snapped, the toolkit I'd stumbled on, my prying inquiries. He noted I struck him as sharp, and sharp folks knew when ignoring trouble paid off. Plenty profited handsomely from feigned blindness, he added, and that option stood open to me. His tone stayed even, no overt menace. None was needed. The subtext hung heavy. Huddled in the shadows, phone clutched tight. I uttered nothing. At last, after an eternity, one final knock. Just that. The sound of footsteps faded into the distance. From the security feed, I saw the man heading back to the storage area, climbing into a black SUV that had somehow escaped my notice earlier, then pulling away down the rear service path. I couldn't stick out the rest of my shift. The instant his taillights vanished from view, I snatched my keys and headed directly to my vehicle. No punching out, no memo, no phone calls to anyone. I simply hit the road. My fingers clenched the wheel until my knuckles throbbed in pain, and for the full 40-minute drive into town, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror. Come morning, I rang my cousin and let him know I was finished, that I'd never set foot in that place again. He didn't push back. He skipped the interrogation. All he offered was his understanding and a promise to handle things with the employer. 7 days later, the regional news reported a blaze at an ag storage site in Harlow County, blamed on a wiring failure. The entire second bay was gutted. No casualties mentioned. No probe launched. The operation closed for fixes and stayed shuttered for good. After that, my cousin went silent on my calls. It's been nearly 2 years since we've talked. At family events, when our paths cross, he behaves as if it all never occurred, like those 6 weeks were wiped clean from our shared history. I'll never know the truth about what went on in that storage bay. I'll never learn that man's identity or the fate of whatever caused the noise I heard behind the door. On certain nights, it still haunts me, tossing in bed at 3 a.m., replaying all the moves I wish I'd made instead. I should have dialed the cops that initial evening after spotting the stain. I should have followed my instincts over my cousin's words. I should have acted rather than fleeing. But I didn't. And that's the weight I carry now. A teaching position opened up a couple of weeks post-chaos, and I dove headfirst into it, pushing to forget, assuring myself the facility's secrets were no longer my concern. Yet occasionally, while navigating dark roads, I'll spot an isolated factory looming in the shadows, unlit and still. A chill knots in my gut. I realize such spots exist all over, hidden corners where unspeakable events unfold in silence, and folks whose role it is to bury them forever. I came perilously close to becoming one of them. At times I question if my survival, my ability to share this tale, stems solely from keeping my mouth shut and letting fear propel me away. I'm unsure which element gnaws at me worse. Out in rural Kansas, you get this strange mix of liberation and utter vulnerability. When my father died in 2017, he bequeathed me 47 acres of ancestral farmland, acquired by my great-grandfather for a song amid the Great Depression. By then, Sheila, my wife, and I had endured a tight Denver rental for 6 years, with our twin girls on the cusp of kindergarten. It seemed like perfect timing. We relocated that September, coinciding with my class reunion, which hit me with how much had changed since I bolted from that little town as a youth, chasing urban dreams. Our land lay at the terminus of a lengthy gravel lane, nearly a mile off the main county road, hemmed in by endless wheat and a handful of ancient oaks predating living memory. The last occupant, Jerry Mullins, who'd assisted my dad with upkeep following his stroke, had vacated 3 months prior to our arrival. The farmhouse required fixes, but it was home, and for the first time as an adult, I sensed real relief. Issues cropped up in late October, roughly 6 weeks into our stay. We'd handled typical country irritants, poachers trespassing on the rear fields, kids turning the vacant barn into a party spot. One dawn, Sheila discovered empty beer bottles and smokes by the weathered silo, and that broke her patience. She insisted on a sturdy barrier, something secure, with a reliable latch to bar casual intruders from our property. I consented mainly to calm her and devoted a full Saturday to erecting a robust metal barrier at the junction of our lane and the county road. From the local shop, I picked up a hefty padlock, master-grade steel, running me close to $40. We each held a copy, and I stashed an extra in the tube of a nearby post for emergencies. On that debut evening, with the gate secured, Sheila clasped my hand over supper and admitted she at last felt protected here. I took her at her word then, and shared the sentiment. 3 days afterward, I stirred awake at roughly 5:00 a.m. to release the dog and spotted the gate standing ajar. Not damaged or pried open, simply left unlocked, swaying lazily in the November breeze as though someone had unfastened it without a care and failed to latch it again. Dressed in my bathrobe and boots, I trudged the full length of that gravel path with a flashlight, scanning for any clues about what had occurred. Zilch. No litter, no discernible footprints amid the shadows. No hint that anybody had even passed through. I convinced myself I'd overlooked securing it tightly, despite vividly recalling the click of the padlock and my double tug to confirm it held. Sheila shot me a glance upon my return indoors, the sort that conveyed her reliance on me to protect us in this remote spot. I assured her it wouldn't recur, and I was sincere. That night I inspected the lock thrice before heading in for supper, yet it transpired once more. The next Monday morning, Sheila discovered it herself, gate flung wide, padlock dangling slack on the chain as if positioned there leisurely by somebody unhurried. This occasion, something knotted my gut. Recent tire marks etched into the soil, deep ruts from a substantial vehicle that had rolled straight up our lane overnight. I trailed those impressions nearly to the homestead before they veered toward the aged barn and faded into the firmer earth by the machinery outbuilding. I scoured that barn from floor to ceiling, probing each compartment, scaling the loft where motes of dust floated in the dawn glow. Nothing taken, nothing askew, yet clearly a visitor had trespassed on our land, a visitor possessing a key. That afternoon I phoned the sheriff, and Deputy Nolan arrived to document the incident, though he appeared mildly disinterested throughout. Quote 3, he remarked. Quote 4. I yearned to accept his view, but those tread patterns narrated otherwise. That very week I swapped the lock, traveling 30 miles to another hardware outlet, since I suspected someone might have copied it from the original vendor. This replacement was bulkier, from a distinct maker, featuring keys etched with an unusual groove. I discarded the prior one completely, ensuring only Sheila and I held duplicates, no extras stashed in the fence post or anywhere. For roughly 10 days, normalcy resumed. The gate remained fastened, the lane deserted, and I began persuading myself that Deputy Nolan was spot on. Perhaps it truly was mischievous youths pulling a stunt. And upon sensing our heightened vigilance, they shifted to simpler marks. Sheila quit peering out the windows each evening prior to sleep. The daughters resumed outdoor play without constant parental supervision. I relaxed my watchfulness. And that's precisely when matters intensified. One mid-November Saturday morning, as I approached to verify the gate, I froze midway along the road at the site before me. The gate was secured, chain coiled firmly, padlock snapped closed exactly as I'd set it. Except it wasn't mine. The device there gleamed silver rather than black, a wholly alien type whose keyhole rejected my keys outright. Overnight, an intruder had accessed our grounds, stripped away my lock, and substituted their own. I lingered there for ages, gazing at it, struggling to comprehend the scene. This wasn't mischief, not adolescents seeking a spot for beers. Whoever orchestrated this aimed to demonstrate they could enter and exit at will, that no barrier I acquired could bar them. They were issuing a warning, and it rang unmistakable. This land was theirs as surely as it was ours. I snipped that lock with bolt cutters and purchased a third that day, though my grip trembled during the entire return trip. Over supper that evening, with the girls already tucked in, Sheila voiced it directly, her tone hushed and measured in a manner that unnerved me beyond any outburst. She confessed feeling vulnerable now, that the perpetrator grasped our habits too well, our sleep cycles, the art of slipping in tracelessly. I attempted to soothe her, vowing we'd resolve it, but honestly, I lacked solutions. Come morning, I rang Deputy Nolan anew, and he examined the severed lock I'd removed, examining it as if it were a novelty instead of proof. He explained his limited options, absent apprehending a culprit mid-act. No actual offense had occurred, no pilfering, no destruction, save the padlocks. He recommended surveillance cameras, perhaps sensor-activated floods, to deter the meddler. It was as if they expected me to handle the issue single-handedly, yet I couldn't think of any other option. That evening, I went ahead and bought a pair of trail cameras from an online retailer, the type hunters rely on for snapping shots of wildlife, and sprang for express delivery to get them fast. They showed up that Wednesday, and I devoted the bulk of the afternoon to setting them up. I positioned one straight toward the entrance, tucked away in a wooden birdhouse that I secured to a tree roughly 20 feet distant, while the other overlooked the gravel path from the edge of our veranda. Both were triggered by movement, built to produce sharp photos in pitch black with infrared technology. I ran tests on them repeatedly, pacing in front of each until I was certain they functioned flawlessly. From the kitchen window, Sheila observed my every move. Once I stepped back indoors, she held me in an embrace that lasted longer than her norm. Deep down, we understood those devices could reveal something that altered our lives forever. Sleep evaded me that night. I kept glancing at my phone hourly for any motion notifications. None came. The following evening passed in the same silence. Nonetheless, each dawn revealed the entrance securely fastened when I went out to inspect. Come Friday, I began suspecting the mere presence of the cameras had deterred the intruder. Perhaps the awareness of surveillance alone was sufficient to halt the intrusions. I ought to have realized it wouldn't be that straightforward. On Saturday morning, my phone buzzed with 3 motion notifications, all logged between 2 and 3 a.m. My throat tightened even before launching the application. The initial shot captured beams of light, nearing the entrance along the rural highway, merely two glowing orbs amid the night. The next was more distinct, a shadowy pickup, possibly blue or green, halted squarely before the barrier, motor humming steadily. Infrared highlighted the vapor trailing from the exhaust in the chilly atmosphere. But the final image froze me in place on the bedside, staring at it for what felt like ages. There was a figure by the entrance, facing away from the lens, clad in a sturdy labor coat and a baseball hat tugged down low. He wasn't tampering with the latch or breaking in. Instead, he held a key and was casually turning it to release the mechanism, just like I did daily, with the assured ease of habit from countless prior occasions. The snapshot seized him in the act, one arm outstretched, the clasp dangling loose in his grasp. He appeared at ease. He seemed right at home. I shared the pictures with Sheila and saw the color drain from her features. She inquired if the vehicle looked familiar, and I admitted it didn't. Still, a vague unease tugged at my mind, the outline, the tail end listing unevenly, as if warped from some long-ago collision. For the subsequent hour, I pored over every captured frame from the cameras, hunting for clues to pinpoint this individual. The one closer to the dwelling had activated as well, depicting the same truck creeping along our lane. Now, with lights extinguished, it glided like a specter through the gloom toward the outbuilding. In total, there were 6 shots of it idling behind the storage unit, lingering there for nearly 40 minutes prior to reversing course and departing via the same path. 40 minutes. This stranger had roamed our land for 40 minutes as my spouse and girls rested soundly indoors, while I slumbered unaware just 200 yards off. I phoned Deputy Nolan once more, and this time he seemed genuinely engaged. He requested I send over the images via email, promising to cross-check the truck against records to uncover any leads. But I was through relying on law enforcement to unravel this mystery. I resolved to uncover the intruder's identity on my own. The very next day, I headed into the local eatery where the longtime residents convened for their morning meals. I reasoned that if word existed about a murky pickup with a warped rear, it would come from folks who'd spent their lives in these parts. Perched at the counter with a mug of Joe, I began probing gently. I framed it as seeking a handyman familiar with the terrain for tasks around my place. Betty, the cashier, caught my words and queried which spread I meant. Upon mentioning it, she paused briefly before advising I chat with Jerry Mullins. The name struck like a blow to the gut. Jerry Mullins, the very fellow who'd toiled under my dad, residing on site as overseer for close to 3 years until our arrival. Betty noted he drove a deep green Ford, an aged rig bearing a battered tailgate from reversing into a fence years back. She added he resided some 15 miles northward in a mobile home by the stream and had faced financial woes since my father dismissed him. I held my tongue on the correction. Dad hadn't fired Jerry. Rather, Jerry had ceased appearing after illness, left my father unable to oversee the grounds. After expressing my gratitude to Betty, I placed a $10 bill on the counter and headed directly to the location she'd provided. There, I spotted Jerry Mullen perched on a weathered plastic chair in front of his mobile home, puffing on a cigarette while gazing down the road as if anticipating a visitor. The truck was right next to him, dark green with a bent tailgate, matching the one captured on my security video. He showed no shock at my arrival. He didn't bother rising when I stepped from my vehicle and approached. I confronted him outright about sneaking onto my land after dark, and he simply inhaled deeply from his smoke before giving a deliberate nod, as casual as if I'd inquired about the forecast. He admitted he still possessed the keys. He explained that my dad had handed him duplicates long ago, during the days when he was free to enter and exit at will, and he'd never found cause to return them. Pressed on his reasons for prowling around in the wee hours, he met my eyes with an expression that could have been remorse or rebellion. I can't decide even now. He confessed to stashing items in the barn, gear, implements, a few pieces of furniture too bulky for his trailer. He assumed the area sat unused, so it wouldn't be an issue. For 3 years, while my father battled illness and then passed away, Jerry had continued his routine visits, acting as if the estate remained under his care, as though time hadn't shifted anything. Rage bubbled up in me. I felt an urge to seize his collar and challenge his audacity, what entitled him to unsettle my household, to leave my wife too frightened to rest soundly in our own house. Yet, eyeing him slumped in that chair, his attire threadbare, his trailer corroded along the seams, exhaustion overtook me more than fury. I instructed him to hand over the keys, all of them, every duplicate he'd ever had. He entered his home silently and returned with a modest metal loop threaded through 4 keys, each tagged with peeling adhesive bearing my father's script. Front gate, barn door, equipment shed, back entrance. He passed them to me, and I gripped them, sensing the burden of the trust my father had once placed in him across those years. I made it clear to Jerry that he was barred from returning, that this chapter was finished. He acknowledged with a nod and crushed his cigarette against the chair's armrest. He apologized, insisting he'd never intended to alarm anybody, that he timed his arrivals for late nights precisely to avoid disturbing us, as if that justified it. As if good intentions could wipe away the dread he'd sown. Back at the house, I recounted the entire episode to Sheila. That same afternoon, we combed through the barn and uncovered precisely what he'd mentioned. Crates of outdated tools, a faulty generator, some soggy furnishings piled in the far corner. No malice, no peril, just the poignant leftovers from a guy unwilling to release his grip on a spot that wasn't his anymore. Over the weekend, I replaced every lock on the grounds, fitted fresh deadbolts, and set up 2 additional cameras for extra security. Deputy Nolan wrapped up the investigation without charges once I explained I preferred not to pursue it. Jerry struck me as more pitiful than felonious, and hauling him into legal proceedings wouldn't erase the anxiety we'd endured for weeks. Sheila still inspects the gate each morning before I stir. Occasionally, I find her by the window in the dead of night, scanning the highway for approaching lights that I hope stay absent forever. We've discussed putting the property on the market or relocating anew, but this acreage has been in my family's possession for nearly 100 years, and I'm not prepared to let a single distressed individual strip that away. The security is upgraded, the surveillance active, and Jerry Mullins hasn't returned. Still, I store those 4 keys in a drawer near my bedside, pulling them out now and then to recall that my deepest dread wasn't some beast or specter. It was merely a fellow with access and no other refuge. Acquiring that 12-acre property outside Charlottesville, Virginia, was meant to rank as my finest choice ever. My 20s had been a blur of tight city rentals in Richmond, where thin walls amplified endless arguments from those around me. Then my grandmother died, leaving funds for a deposit, and I jumped at the chance without second thoughts. The farmhouse dated to the 1940s per official documents, featuring a drooping veranda, ancient cabinetry in the kitchen, and a water pump that rattled each dawn like it was suffering. But it nestled at the terminus of a winding dirt lane, hemmed in by forest on 3 flanks. For the first time as an adult, silence reigned, no neighbors in earshot. As a remote medical transcriptionist, I transcribed physicians' reports in comfortable loungewear so the seclusion fit like a glove. My nearest resident was Harold Jennings, an elderly widower in his 80s residing roughly a mile away. I had an arrangement with my neighbor where I'd visit him twice weekly, and he'd watch over my place whenever I was gone. By June, after 8 months in the house, I finally sensed a real sense of home. That Saturday unfolded much like any ordinary weekend morning. I rose around 9 o'clock, brewed some coffee, and hunkered down at my workspace to tackle a pile of overdue transcription jobs. For my evening meal, I whipped up spaghetti and binge-watched a few installments of a Netflix true crime series. How fitting, given the events that unfolded later. At about 11 o'clock, I leashed up my dog, Pepper, for her final potty outing of the evening. She was a 6-year-old mixed breed from the shelter, sporting brown and white spots with one ear that always dangled limply. The night air hung heavy and muggy, as it often did in early June, Virginia, that sticky warmth that sticks right to you. From the porch, I observed Pepper nosing about the lawn, glancing up at the stars dotting the sky. Something impossible to catch amid city lights. Silence enveloped everything but the chirps of crickets and a distant owl's call from the tree line. Once Pepper was done, she padded back in, and I secured the front entrance, double-checked the rear one as usual, then hit the sack near midnight, utterly at ease. I couldn't say how much time had passed in sleep before Pepper's growl pulled me awake. This wasn't her usual bark at a squirrel by the glass or a passing vehicle on the highway. It was a deep, persistent rumble from her core, and she positioned herself at my bedroom entrance, staring down the corridor. I snatched my phone from the bedside table and noted the hour, 1:47 a.m. For a moment, I simply remained in bed, straining to listen and pinpoint what alarmed her. Then it came. 3 deliberate raps on the front door. Not forceful or urgent, just courteous taps, as if the visitor aimed to be mannerly. My immediate concern jumped to Harold. Perhaps he'd taken a tumble or wandered over in a daze. At his age, those fears lingered for me. Slipping from bed, I tiptoed to the living area. Pepper glued to my side with that ongoing low vibration. The door featured a narrow upper pane, but the blackness outdoors revealed little. To the side stood a porch-facing window draped in sheer fabric. I kept the lights off, Some gut feeling urged caution, an intuition tough to pin down. Remaining shrouded in shadow, I peered through the drapes. Another set of knocks followed, accompanied by a man's steady, amiable tone. His vehicle had stalled roughly half a mile along the route, phone battery drained, and he wondered if he might borrow mine to summon aid. It seemed plausible, the sort of mishap anyone could face on these rural stretches with unreliable signal, yet at nearly 2 a.m., as a solitary woman, the whole scenario sent tension rippling through me. Edging nearer the glass, I nudged the curtain aside barely an inch for a clearer view of my porch visitor. He appeared utterly ordinary, the very quality that sowed doubt. Around 40 years old, clad in jeans and a simple dark tee, medium frame, cropped brown hair. Pockets held his hands, and he lingered several paces from the entrance, not crowding it like a frantic or threatening sort might. He resembled an everyday fellow sidelined by auto woes. I nearly talked myself out of suspicion, blaming those true crime binges for my jitters. But Pepper persisted with her growl, fur bristling along her back. That pup had impeccable judgment on folks. I'd watched her greet unknowns with wagging enthusiasm and snarl at others who proved shady down the line. Her senses were reliable, so I opted against unlocking the door, calling out instead. I offered to phone on his behalf, inquiring for the contact. Grateful, he provided a name, mentioned his sibling just 20 miles off, who could retrieve him, even recited digits. Everything rang so everyday, so logical. Phone clutched, I prepared to punch them in, but stole another peek through the adjacent pane. With the porch unlit and only a partial moon glowing, my vision had sharpened in the gloom by now. He waited there calmly. That's when motion caught my eye near the woodland border at my lot's far side, perhaps 50 yards distant. Initially, I figured a deer, common enough here, but the silhouette didn't fit. It stood erect, a figure creeping parallel to the trees, angling toward my home's rear. My pulse hammered fiercely, surging up to my neck. I glanced over my shoulder at the guy lingering on the porch, his face locked in that unflappable serenity, as if urgency was a foreign concept to him. He seemed oblivious to the fact that I'd spotted the other intruder. Or perhaps he was fully aware, and this was all unfolding according to some scheme. I eased away from the window, careful not to jerk abruptly, my brain scrambling for a plan. Options flashed through my head. Dialing 911 might work, though the closest sheriff's station sat at least 25 minutes distant, and I had no clue how long I could hold out. Reaching out to Harold felt pointless. What could an 80-year-old do in a pinch? My thoughts drifted to the rear entrance, questioning if it was truly secured, and whether that shadowy figure was already probing it. The porch visitor rapped harder on the door, inquiring whether all was well. His tone stayed cordial on the surface, yet an edge of frustration seeped through. From behind the barrier, I claimed I was phoning his sibling at that very moment, assuring him assistance would arrive shortly. It was pure delay tactic, granting me seconds to sort my next move. I slipped swiftly and silently across the shadowed rooms to the kitchen, peering out the window over the sink into the yard. The other silhouette had drawn nearer, perhaps 30 yards off, and now I made out a burly fellow in shadowy attire and a hat, striding openly toward the back entry as if it were his domain. no pretense of concealment left. I snatched the largest blade from the counter's knife rack. It wasn't ideal, but it offered some defense. Hurrying back to the front, I informed the porch man that the door stayed shut. I insisted I'd already alerted 911 and officers were en route. Another fabrication. I hadn't placed the call yet, but I needed him convinced. Silence stretched out. From my vantage, his features were hidden, but tension thickened the atmosphere, signaling a pivot in the encounter. When he responded, the warmth had evaporated. His words came sharp. "Look, I only want to borrow your phone. Why complicate things?" It wasn't seeking permission. It rang like a command. Then came the jiggle of the back door latch. Not a tap, but a deliberate twist to check its give. Pepper lost it completely, her barks turning to fierce growls as she lunged rearward. The front door battering commenced, no longer polite knocks but heavy thuds, his shouts lost amid her frenzy and the roar in my head. At last, I punched in 911, my hands quivering enough to nearly fumble the device twice. The operator picked up, and words tumbled from me in a rush, barely coherent. Two strangers attempting forced entry, me solitary here, urgent aid required. She requested the address which I supplied, promising to keep the connection open while dispatching responders. Deep down, I recognized the reality. Units were 20 minutes out at best. Likely longer. I was isolated in this standoff. The front door assault halted abruptly, plunging everything into a hush that chilled deeper than the chaos. Rooted in the corridor linking both ends of the home, I clutched the knife in one grip and the phone in the other, Pepper huddled against my thigh with persistent rumbles. Porch steps creaked faintly, then fell still. Abruptly, shattering glass echoed from the rear, not the door itself, but a pane in the laundry nook, that spot I'd long intended to reinforce but procrastinated on. Pepper charged the noise, her yelps piercingly shrill. A male voice swore, followed by further crunching as shards were shoved aside. At the laundry threshold, I caught sight of a hulking form, wedged midway through the opening, one limb already breaching the interior. Instinct overrode thought. I bellowed an unintelligible warning and lashed out with the blade toward his limb. It struck true, meeting flesh, and he howled, yanking free so hastily he shredded himself further on the jagged edges. Crimson streaked the knife and sill. Tremors racked me. I teetered on the verge of crumbling. The operator pressed for updates, but my account stuttered out, garbled. I retreated from the breach, braced for a renewed assault there or at the front, yet stillness reigned briefly. Pepper's alerts shifted to wilder pitches, as if sensing shifts I missed. My gaze darted from the entry to the fractured pane, realizing I couldn't guard both simultaneously. A vehicle motor coughed to life, distant at first along the crunching gravel path. The noise intensified, and I caught the screech of tires skidding over gravel. Rushing to the living room window, I spotted tail lights vanishing rapidly along the highway, with no headlights piercing the night. They were fleeing. Confusion hit me initially. I remained tense, expecting an intruder to burst through a door or shatter glass, but the commotion outside dwindled until only crickets chirped and Pepper whined softly at my side. I stayed connected to the dispatcher for 18 more minutes before flashing red and blue lights appeared in my driveway. Two deputies approached the entrance, and I cautiously unbolted it, clutching the knife tightly and trembling. One, a female officer called Hartley, carefully pried the blade from my grip and guided me to a chair as her colleagues swept the interior for threats. They discovered bloodstains on the laundry room pane and a bloody path trailing into the nearby woods, where their vehicle was likely hidden. The officers assured me I'd handled it wisely, that fortune had favored me since most folks would have let a stranger in. The sheriff's team probed the case for weeks, yet turned up nothing. No DNA hits in databases, no observers, no discarded vehicle with a damaged tire close to my lane. It felt as if they'd evaporated into thin air. But what haunts my sleep even after 2 years is this. Roughly 3 weeks post-incident, a deputy phoned to link my ordeal to 2 prior events in the area from the year before. Identical setup, a guy at the door after dark claiming vehicle woes, another figure lurking nearby. In those instances, residents had answered. One lady suffered a severe beating and theft. The other, an elderly pair, lost the husband to the attack. These criminals preyed on remote dwellings, spots distant from aid, where folks hadn't yet learned to distrust nighttime visitors at the threshold. I never learned their fate. Half a year on, I relocated to Richmond. Pepper remains with me, and she occasionally growls at shadows in the dark without apparent cause. On those nights, sleep evades me. I simply hunker in the blackness, ears attuned, dreading a rap at the door that might never sound. 14 years grinding away in a New Jersey warehouse had worn me down, in depths I only grasped after walking away. When my friend Glenn floated the idea of a temporary farm oversight role in the Virginia countryside, I seized it impulsively. My fiancé and I had split the spring prior. Music. I was holed up in a dismal one-room rental, and visions of vast landscapes seemed like a cure. The agreement was straightforward. Half a year managing soybean plots for a farming outfit, complete with a complimentary on-site house. I packed my Ford truck and headed 5 hours southward on a crisp Wednesday in early September 2018. The site lay at the terminus of a dirt track named Hendricks Mill Lane, roughly 12 miles from the closest village boasting a market. The dwelling was unremarkable. A pair of bedrooms, a cooking area reeking of aged timber, and a veranda encircling 3 walls. Yet the surrounding fields rolled out broad and sun-kissed in the waning warmth. For the first time in ages, breathing felt effortless. I convinced myself this was the reset I craved. That initial week unfolded smoothly. I devoted daylight hours to mastering the watering setup, gauging earth dampness, and patrolling the edges of the 300-acre tract under my watch. Contract docks indicated the closest homestead lay about a half-mile eastward, though local files marked it vacant, held by an ag entity out of Richmond. From my kitchen view, I could make out the silhouette of a house and expansive silo, both shadowy amid the tree line. No autos parked, no stirrings, 0 hints of habitation. The solitude required adjustment, particularly after dusk, when the quiet grew so profound that my pulse thrummed audibly as I lay awake. Still, I stayed occupied, checked in with my mother periodically, and eased into a rhythm that bordered on serene. On the 8th evening, a Tuesday, that's when the oddity began. Around 11 p.m., while rinsing after brushing, I peered from the lavatory pane, music, and noticed a dim amber gleam emanating from the presumed deserted estate next door. Just one bulb, possibly from an upper-level casement, holding firm against the gloom. I dismissed it as trivial, likely the owners dispatching an inspector or a maintenance worker dropping in now and then. I wrapped up my routine and retired, though that illumination lingered in my thoughts. Come dawn, I toured the borders routinely, but eased off the gas near the eastern fence. Up close from the path, the adjacent abode appeared as forsaken as ever, flaking ivory siding, weeds thrusting through pavement fissures, a corroded post box tilted at 45 degrees. Not a single ride in sight. I pulled my truck to a stop and approached the fence, scanning for recent tire marks or boot prints. There were none. The site appeared deserted for ages. I pulled out my phone to double-check the details I'd recalled from the county files. Sure enough, it was all there in plain text, owned by the Shenandoah Valley Agricultural Trust, currently vacant, with the latest activity noted in 2014. Heading back to my farmhouse, I felt foolish for letting it bother me at all. Abandoned homes often have wiring oddities, automated bulbs, plenty of rational reasons. Yet that very evening, it recurred. Around 10 o'clock, I was out on the rear porch, sipping a cold beer amid the chirping crickets, when 3 lights flickered on one after another over on the adjacent land. It started with the upper-story pane, followed by a ground-level glow, then illumination from within the barn. They lingered for about 20 minutes before extinguishing in the opposite sequence. My beer grew tepid in my grip as I stared at the shadowy outline against the tree line, braced for whatever might follow. Nothing did. The estate remained pitch black and still, as if forsaken from the start. I headed indoors and secured every entrance, an absurd precaution since I'd never bothered before moving in. Sleep evaded me that night. I jolted awake twice to unexplained noises, a distant growl that could have been a car on some far-off highway, a steady groan, likely from the structure shifting. Come dawn, I peered through the panes prior to brewing coffee, eyes sweeping the tree line for any stir. The next Saturday, I headed into town for provisions and resolved to inquire about the place next door. Burkeville was a modest hamlet built around a filling station, a tool shop, and Maxine's Diner, the obvious hub for locals. I took a stool at the counter and requested coffee plus eggs from a silver-haired lady in her 60s, her locks twisted into a neat bun. Her badge read, Darlene. As she delivered my plate, I brought up my work on the Henderson job along Hendricks Mill Lane, and she gave a knowing dip of her head. Typical small-town vibe. I inquired about the land to my east, held by that farming trust, and her face shifted subtly, not outright alarmed, but wary somehow. She claimed limited knowledge, noting how ownership flipped frequently in these parts, before drifting off to top up another's mug. I turned to the burly fellow 2 seats away, clad in a John Deere hat and methodically downing pancakes. He eyed me steadily, fork hovering with syrup trailing, then delivered words etched in my mind. Best steer clear of meddling with folks' borders around here. I pushed for clarification, but he merely shook his head and resumed eating. The entire eatery fell hushed, and I sensed multiple gazes on me, some sympathetic, others edged with stern caution. I wolfed down my meal without savoring it and left an oversized gratuity, figuring it might prompt chatter. It didn't. In the lot, I encountered an elderly gent hefting fertilizer sacks into his truck and gave asking one last shot. As a newcomer, I explained, merely aiming to grasp the terrain, and wondered if he had details on the eastern parcel. He paused his task and fixed me with faded blue eyes that spoke of 7 decades or so of harsh seasons. The ground over there carries a past that its holders prefer private, he advised, and suggested I follow suit. Probing for specifics on that past, he simply hopped into his cab and rumbled off wordlessly. I lingered in the gravel as though I'd stumbled into a long-running dialogue everyone grasped except me, conducted in some foreign tongue. Everything shifted that evening. About 1 a.m., half dozing in bed, I caught the crunch of tires over loose stones, methodical and unhurried, crawling at roughly 5 miles per hour. I rose silently and sidled to the glass, staying flush to the frame to observe unseen. A sizable truck or perhaps an SUV crept by on Hendricks Mill Lane. Hard to pinpoint in the gloom, for it ran without beams, just an inky form gliding through the deeper shadows, motor humming low. It skirted my access and pressed onward to the eastern site, vanishing at the curve. I held position at the sill for around 15 minutes until it re-emerged from the opposite direction. Identical pace, quietude, and lightlessness. This time, the vehicle crept by even slower right past my place. I could have sworn I sensed someone peering at my windows, though no one was visible inside the car. My pulse hammered so fiercely it seemed to throb right up my neck. Once it was gone, I couldn't return to sleep. Instead, I stayed in the kitchen with all the lights extinguished, peering out the window over the sink at the road until daylight broke. Dawn delivered an even grimmer discovery. As part of my new daily routine, I circled the edges of my farmhouse, music inspecting for any irregularities, and that's when I spotted the tracks. They appeared in the loose soil under my bedroom window, 2 clear boot impressions, music sunk deep enough to indicate the person had lingered there for some time. The window sat roughly 5 feet above the ground, too elevated for a casual glance inside. Yet if the intruder had tiptoed or used a boost, they'd have gotten a straight shot of my bed. I knelt to examine the marks closely, committing every feature to memory. Work boots, probably size 11 or 12, featuring a unique scuff on the left heel. Additional tracks trailed from the window, weaving across the lawn to the rear of the land. I pursued them about 200 yards until they hit an abandoned irrigation channel slicing through the fields to the eastern edge. The channel lay parched and choked with weeds, long neglected, but a slim trail of flattened plants ran through it. Clearly, somebody had been exploiting this route to slip onto my grounds undetected from the street. That afternoon, I contacted the sheriff's office. Around 4 o'clock, a deputy called Womack arrived. A lanky fellow with a red-burned neck and weary eyes that hinted he'd witnessed the worst of it all more than once. I pointed out the footprints, now baked solid in the afternoon warmth, and led him to the irrigation channel. He heard me out without a word, just nodding now and then, jotting down zilch. At the end, he paused, gazing toward the eastern boundary for what felt like ages, then finally replied. He explained that around these parts, people prized their solitude and boundaries got messy with ancient water rights and shared lanes from way back. Music. I insisted that a prowler had spied on me right through my bedroom pane, and he acknowledged my worry but claimed his hands were tied absent stronger proof. No actual offense had occurred, technically. As he departed, he handed me his card and suggested calling if more cropped up, but his tone made it seem like mere formality. I watched his patrol car fade along Hendricks Mill Lane and knew I was utterly isolated out here. That evening, I shoved my dresser against the bedroom window, music, and kept a kitchen knife handy by the bed. The following 3 days passed uneventfully, and I nearly talked myself into believing I'd blown it out of proportion. Perhaps the tracks came from a land surveyor or a utility inspector. Maybe the headlight-free vehicle was merely a neighbor cutting through without rousing folks. I dove into my tasks, logging endless hours in the fields, forcing my mind onto dirt tests and watering plans rather than shadows in the night. But on the 4th evening, a Wednesday, I jolted awake at 3 a.m. to footsteps on my porch. No hallucination, no dream, just actual steps. Music unhurried and purposeful, groaning over the weathered planks. I froze in bed, scarcely daring to breathe, as the sounds shifted from one side of the porch to the other. Then they halted directly at my front entrance. The knob rattled faintly, probing the lock. It held firm. The steps continued, skirting the house's flank, lingering by every window. I followed the noise mentally. Living room, kitchen, bathroom, then the rear entrance. Another knob jiggle, music, another secure door. Then utter quiet. A stillness so profound it buzzed in my head. I didn't stir until the first rays seeped past the drapes. When I rose to investigate, fresh boot prints encircled the whole structure. Identical size, identical heel scuff. I resolved to stop passive waiting for escalation. Come morning, I headed to the hardware shop in Burkeville and picked up a trail camera, the sort for tracking game trails. I fixed it to a tree overlooking the irrigation channel, positioned to snag footage of anyone approaching from that side. I grabbed another and set it at the porch's edge, pointed toward the front door and the gravel drive. The salesman, a young fellow named Sutton sporting a scruffy beard and fidgety fingers, inquired if wildlife was the issue. I replied, it was along those lines. He eyed me a moment longer than needed before processing the sale, and I suspected he grasped the real nature of my predicament. That evening, I parked my pickup at the boundary of the land, engine silenced and windows open, peering at the tree border to the east with binoculars I'd bought online just 2 days earlier. Near midnight they appeared, a pair of silhouettes slipping out from the barn on the adjacent farm, heading my way across the open ground. They traveled one behind the other, hunched down, relying on the landscape to hide their progress. I tracked them as they dropped into the irrigation channel roughly 300 yards away. Then they vanished into the shadows. My fingers clenched the wheel until my knuckles throbbed. Part of me itched to rev the engine and blast them with the beams, but instinct warned that could escalate everything. So I held still until faint footsteps crunched close to my home. That's when I blared the horn for a full 30 seconds. The blast ripped through the quiet like an explosion. As it faded, I caught the sound of hurried, frantic steps dashing back to the channel. The motion sensors recorded it all. Two guys, features half hidden under tugged-down baseball caps, stepping onto my land at about 12:15 a.m. The video was fuzzy, yet distinct enough to spot they were hauling gear, perhaps a duffel stuffed with implements. Hard to say exactly. I transferred the clips to my cell and headed directly to the state trooper station 40 miles up north, steering clear of the county sheriff. The officer who examined the recording, a no-nonsense type called Kendrick with her gray hair buzzed short and zero tolerance for chit-chat, placed a few calls as I sat in the waiting area. After an hour, she shared what the area folks wouldn't. The land to the east was under federal scrutiny. Involved some covert growing operation buried in the remote sections, plus supply lines weaving through outlying spots owned by absent landlords. The agricultural trust served as cover, and the crew running things there had been keeping tabs on me from the moment I showed up, gauging whether I was a cop or merely a contractor who'd stumbled into trouble. Officer Kendrick helped me end my rental agreement right then. No fees, no interrogations. I loaded all my belongings in less than 2 hours and headed north, eyes fixed ahead. Word came later of a bust about 3 weeks post-departure. Several takedowns, the entire setup torn apart. Even now, those solitary evenings in that old farmhouse linger in my thoughts. The pacing steps in the gloom, the gazes lurking from the woods. The rural expanse had looked so serene upon my arrival, desolate and hushed. Yet that hush wasn't void. It was just the neighbors all around me frozen, anticipating my next move. Back then, my existence felt modest and subdued, exactly the respite I craved. I'd leased this remote rural dwelling nestled amid croplands and winding lanes that only farm rigs and haulers seemed to navigate instinctively. My remote job meant irregular shifts, and after dusk, human contact was rare. The structure was aged yet sturdy, featuring sturdy entrances, slim panes, and an extended stone drive that melted into obscurity after dark. Typical nights involved a single light glowing, breezes rustling the branches, and the remote buzz of bugs. I appreciated the seclusion as if society had granted me a temporary reprieve. That detachment was precisely why I'd selected it. It hadn't crossed my mind that my solitude might draw unwanted notice. The initial oddity struck one late night while I was washing a cup in the kitchen, and suddenly the space flickered with light. Headlight glow swept the distant partition, creeping steadily, not the flash of a vehicle zipping by. I edged toward the glass and observed the rays inching along the perimeter, fading just past the foliage. It didn't unsettle me initially. Country machines behave erratically, and the local paths curved illogically without frequent travel. But it recurred. Invariably past midnight, invariably languid. Occasionally, the illumination would linger, motor humming softly out of view, steady and unhurried. When it departed at last, the night seemed denser. A few weeks on, unfamiliar noises crept into the pattern. Dawn's edge, right before the horizon paled, subtle snaps and gentle tugs echoed from the entryway, not forceful or hasty, more akin to testing a secured vehicle in a lot. One dawn, it shifted to the rear entrance. Another instance, a frame by the wash area. The intruder never lingered, and no harm showed. I'd inspect the place later, pulse racing, discovering all intact as before. That perfection somehow amplified the unease. Unbreached barriers implied the tester was content to bide time. The tempest hit abruptly, thundering in with force, pounding the meadows with downpour and whipping the limbs until they creaked. The electricity flickered off, followed by the cell phone signal vanishing entirely, turning the home into a cocoon of pattering rain and eerie quiet. Flickering candles did little to fend off the blackness, while gusts battered the outer walls as if eavesdropping on every creak. That's when the beams of light reappeared in the driveway, shining even more intensely this time, halting so near that their glare seeped beneath the drapes. I froze in place, struck by a realization that twisted my gut with dread. The person lurking out there hadn't attempted to force their way inside earlier. Instead, they'd been studying the layout of the place, getting a read on my routines, biding their time until isolation sealed off any chance of rescue. I held motionless, ears straining to the intervals between howling winds and the faint purr of a motor idling just past the tree line. The downpour concealed minor noises, though not completely. Pebbles crunched underfoot. Measured steps sank into the sodden earth, deliberate to avoid any splatter. A slender silhouette glided by a flanking window, halting right at the pane's border. The motion carried no urgency, no frenzy, just the smoothness of actions drilled through mental practice sessions. I retreated from the glass, hugging the shadows in the room's dimmest corner, forcing my breaths to stay even as the structure groaned in the gale. The initial probe arrived at the rear entrance, not a rap or a slam, but a subtle twist of the knob, probing the lock's give. The faint scrape of metal on metal echoed briefly. It paused, then resumed with greater care, as though the intruder sought to gauge the precise force required. I tiptoed down the corridor, every floorboard a potential snitch. The trembling flashlight in my grip cast jittery rays across the surfaces. By the time I slipped into the kitchen, the fiddling ceased, giving way to an extended, contemplative hush. I pictured a figure enduring the torrent, palm flat against the wood, pondering the next move. Time warped into an endless drag. The tempest roared, lightning booming nearby enough to shake the cupboards. Soon, the prodding resumed, now targeting a pane beside the lounge. Digits grazed the surface, methodical and unhurried, outlining the frame as if committing it to memory. I huddled behind the sofa, my dead phone clenched uselessly, fully grasping my severance from the world. No glow from adjacent homes, no traffic rumbling by, only endless meadows swallowed by night. That's the moment it sank in. This wasn't a hasty intrusion. It was a siege of endurance, letting terror erode my defenses over time. At last, the activity quieted. Those lights lingered a bit more, bathing the exterior in stark pallor before withdrawing into the gloom. Sleep eluded me entirely. Come dawn, I gathered essentials into a bag and departed, leaving the door ajar, the tires grinding harshly over the drive as I sped off. Afterward, a county officer surveyed the grounds and discovered only profound imprints embedded in the muck by each entry point. Nothing indicated tampering. I never returned. That relentless watchfulness outside had no desire for a rematch. As weeks turned to months, the unease clung like a persistent chill. The headlights, the subtle probes, they shadowed my thoughts, impossible to shake. It's tempting to dismiss it as mere odd happenstance or some rational cause, yet in my core I rejected that. I still puzzle over how anyone could map the interior so intimately without crossing the threshold, or why the efforts stayed exploratory, never aggressive. The ordeal defied any tidy resolution. No leads emerged, no proof surfaced. The authorities offered standard vigilance advice and filed it away, but I remained trapped in it. Eventually, I started my own search for clarity or closure amid the oddity. What I uncovered chilled me. A parallel incident in a neighboring community years prior. A lone woman in another weathered rural dwelling had spotted recurring lights circling her property, then peculiar activity at her thresholds. She fled as well, but authorities had shelved her report by then. They hadn't even interviewed her face-to-face. Her account vanished under red tape, much like my own. That evening replays in my mind. The void left by the fading beams rang louder than any clamor I've known, a stillness loaded with implication. In the aftermath, I've come to understand a few harsh truths. The thin veil of security we cling to, how swiftly it unravels. Yet one detail torments me above all. The intruder had no intent for my flight. They anticipated the instant escape became impossible, and that, more than anything, robs me of rest. Sharing this feels off-kilter, but the weight endures. Perhaps fragments will strike a chord with someone reading. Back then, my days were straightforward but frayed at the seams. It was one of those periods where stillness seemed to fix all my troubles. I'd recently picked up a run-down countryside property at a local government sale, lured by the bargain cost and the allure of seclusion. The ad portrayed it as deserted for ages, an overlooked expanse with a weathered house and a sagging outbuilding tilted against the breeze. I pictured leisurely dawns, hands-on labor, and a hush that city life could never offer. My buddies called it a rash decision, but rash music beat standing still any day. The trip to get there dragged on forever, with dusty lanes extending beyond what I'd anticipated. When I finally turned the key in the front door, dusk was already falling, casting the meadows in muted, level shades. Those initial moments involved airing out the place, chasing away the musty atmosphere from each space. Grime blanketed everything, yet not in the even layer typical of forsaken spots. Tucked in a wardrobe off the sleeping quarters, garments dangled from odd hooks, arms rigid but undamaged. On the cooking area's counter, tins of provisions stood in a row, tags worn but whole, a few positioned with an attentiveness that clashed with neglect. An open journal rested on the surface, crammed with tight script, time stamps from just recent months back. That one fact hooked me harder than any other, since the sale documents insisted the site had been unoccupied for years. I roamed from chamber to chamber, spotting minor elements that seemed interrupted more than discarded. A seat turned to the glass, sturdy footwear near the entrance, a partially spent lump of lather. Nothing aligned with the narrative I'd purchased. As twilight deepened, the estate shifted its mood. Noises traveled unusually far, every groan of timber cracking crisply through the clear evening. While hauling gear from my vehicle, a low boom resounded from the outbuilding, resonant and vacant. It didn't come from gusts or critter rustlings. It felt intentional, like mass repositioning. I froze, straining my ears, instinctively tracking each inhale. The outbuilding's gates remained closed, secured as I'd secured them before. Approaching, the scent of straw and moist soil intensified, and the racket ceased entirely. That quiet weighed more than the racket ever had. Come evening, intrigue overrode wariness. Armed with a light, I traversed the grounds once more. Its ray sliced through overgrown weeds, snagging on stirrings that proved illusory. Close to the music outbuilding, new impressions marked the soil, distinct and fresh, trailing from the entrance toward the dwelling. Not my own, and certainly not faded. The prints traced a route I'd taken that day, then diverged, looping around to approach the home. Rooted in place, I sensed vulnerability in a way tough to articulate, as if the terrain were eyeing me. I bolted every entry upon returning indoors, music verifying twice, despite knowing it altered little. Rest arrived in snatches, shattered by the intuition that the structure held more than it let on. Dawn's glow failed to deliver the comfort I'd hoped for. The building appeared mundane once more, nearly benign, yet the night's observations lingered stubbornly. Sipping brew from a flask, I pored over the journal from before, scanning the lines deliberately. The script veered from everyday tasks to pointed remarks on sounds, ajar portals, and forms by the tree line. A single sheet alluded to a figure accessing the outbuilding night after night, departing without a sign come light. That jarred against the documented history I'd checked prior to music acquiring the site. Thus, I headed to the closest village for inquiries. The district bureau was compact, hushed, with a whiff of aged documents. Bringing up the property, the attendant hesitated unduly before replying. Per the files, the former residents had vanished suddenly, alluding to hazards that escaped official logs. No law enforcement logs, no checks, no subsequent checks. It got handled as a discreet move, the sort country folk do sans details. An elderly fellow in line behind me chimed in, recalling flickers of illumination sweeping that terrain deep into the wee hours, well past when it should have been void. Music. He dismissed it as intruders or youths seeking mischief, though his tone rang hollow. On the return drive, I spotted wheel marks along the boundary that were absent yesterday. They halted just shy of the path, suggesting evasion of notice in transit. Upon arriving home, the feeling of scrutiny resurfaced. That midday, I tackled overgrowth near the outbuilding, aiming to anchor myself through exertion. Within, the atmosphere seemed overly stuffy, laced with hints of perspiration and aged cloth. In one partitioned area, a coverlet lay tidily stacked, retaining contours of fresh occupation. Snacks casings hid behind a post, the sort scarfed down swiftly, intent on silence. Nothing in there was mine, and it all seemed too new to fit an empty, forgotten spot. As dusk settled once more, those noises came back, heavy steps creaking overhead in the loft. I shouted into the silence, my words bouncing off the walls and beams without effect, and everything halted right away. Darkness dropped quicker than expected. Peering from the farmhouse panes, I spotted a dim glow pulsing in the barn, subtle yet impossible to miss. This round, I wasn't rushing in without a plan. Snatching the truck keys, I revved up and swung the beams across the yard, bathing the area in stark illumination. The barn gaped wide, doors flung open, the chains sliced neatly apart. Empty inside, though fresh tracks marked the ground, trailing directly toward the dwelling. I didn't linger to poke around more. I bolted from the site before the clock struck 12, driving till my grip relaxed on the steering, and only came back after a few days, back up in tow. The place got flipped quietly not long after, and the mystery of the hidden resident, who they were and why they froze at my arrival, stayed unsolved. Stepping onto the land later felt off, as if the ground itself had turned against me. I'd recruited a level-headed buddy who brushed off frights, and we scoured the acres under broad daylight. The house appeared the same, but the barn revealed changes. The cloth had disappeared, wrappers cleared away, loft tidied spotless like deliberate wiping of traces. Tracks even blurred over, soil raked even with some weighty tool. My pal chuckled it away, pinning it on jittery trespassers spooked by the sale. But the excuse rang hollow right off his tongue. The tidying screamed deliberate, not hasty. We combed hours over buildings, outbuildings, fence stretches. At the distant boundary, shrouded in high brush, a slim trail snaked into the trees. Uncharted, just trodden faintly from habit. Pathside clues dotted it. A dented drink tin, cloth shred caught on bark, partial sole prints packed with earth. The user clearly traveled light on evidence. Pausing there, it hit me how simple it'd be to monitor the home from cover. Biding till lamps dimmed. The solitude I'd chased morphed into raw vulnerability. That evening I crashed at a local inn rather than the house. Rest hit smoother, yet my mind looped to the journal and its fresh entries. Picturing a secret dweller amid the facade of desertion rattled deeper than any racket. No spectral tale or showdown, just subtle intrusion, a presence near enough for steps to echo, routines to map, and a swift fade when spotted. Officials dropped it cold. Nobody cared to dig up old dirt. Quiet, it turns out, shields tight in tight-knit spots. Ultimately, I went pragmatic. Put the farm on the market, offloaded it sans another slumber there, kept mum on the items and prints, claimed the terrain didn't suit. Now and then, I ponder the shadow dweller and their abrupt halt at my sight. Perhaps they shifted to another overlooked nook, or honed their stealth. No clue. That's the echo that sticks. The spread showed me seclusion rarely equals void, and certain grounds hold echoes of folks beyond faded files. Settling that home kicked off a subdued phase in my days. Or so I figured then. I'd freshly claimed a modest patch way off the grid, hemmed by endless meadows that outlasted my tolerance for jams. Routine was basic back there. Remote gigs till noon, sorting crates post-lunch, evening strolls to shake off fog. The village evoked deliberate time capsule, single thoroughfare, weathered shops, homes dotted sparse for seclusion. I posted about seeking solitude online, but really, I sought space from the mess I'd fled. The dwelling was plain, squeaky boards, dated cupboards, deck tilting a touch port side. Yet it offered the fresh start I craved. Neighbors popped by quick in week one. Courteous, curt. Names faded fast, but stares stuck. Some holding gaze overlong in chat. Talks stuck to script. Stay duration, home office setup, bedtime habits. Initially, I wrote it off as rural nosiness, the sort folks flag but skim details on. Each greeting from the other side of the street seemed deliberate, perfectly timed. Rachel, who resided a couple of homes away, offhandedly pointed out that my porch lamp remained lit into the night. She chuckled as she said it, though the remark carried more weight than she might have realized. Soon enough, folks began remarking on my habits without me ever mentioning them first. A person at the corner shop inquired whether my early strolls aided my rest, despite me keeping that detail to myself. A nearby resident advised steering clear of specific rural paths after dusk, providing no explanation aside from a casual lift of the shoulders and a hazy cautionary note. What struck me as oddest wasn't the guidance per se, but its uniformity, like the whole town had scripted the exact phrases. Night after night, I spotted silhouettes hovering by barriers or vehicles that had suddenly appeared, absent just seconds earlier. Drapes on the opposite side twitched every time I stepped out the front. I began altering my schedule secretly, hoping the observations would cease. They persisted. The initial fracture in my feeling of security arrived subtly, simple to overlook. One cabinet in the kitchen, which I was certain I'd shut, stood ajar upon my return from a brief errand. No items gone, no damage done, and the doors secured just as before. In the following days, it repeated. Minor displacements, a seat shifted slightly, a pane unsecured yet undamaged. When I brought it up at the precinct, the deputy heard me out with a strained tolerance that rang false. He attributed it to anxiety, frayed edges from adjustment, and assured me locals valued personal space. On the way back, that identical stationary vehicle caught my eye again at my drive's boundary, where it had sat previously. Motor off, wheels caked in dirt. That's when it hit me. Surveillance wasn't mere observation. It was oversight. Rest turned choppy thereafter, not from clamor, but from the oppressive quiet closing around me. After dark, the residents emitted noises I couldn't pinpoint, gentle creaks unrelated to aging timber. I began positioning items precisely, noting the tilt of a cup's grip or the edge of a mat's fold. Several times I roused to discover those specifics changed by dawn. Occasionally, the indoor atmosphere held a subtle aroma foreign to me, reminiscent of strange cleanser or chilled cloth from some forgotten closet. When I queried Rachel about intruders on her land, she hesitated noticeably before replying. She explained that the community watches over one another and I ought to appreciate the vigilance. As time wore on, the impression of control over protection intensified. Residents materialized upon my arrival, as though signaled the instant my wheels crunched on the drive. A fellow I'd never exchanged words with called me by name, propped against my post box, noting my delay from the norm. I questioned his knowledge, and he grinned as if I'd posed a childish query. Quote 7, he replied. Quote 8. Order lingered in my mind. Though his delivery lacked serenity, it echoed more like a mandate than comfort. I experimented with resistance on a minor scale, lingering away longer, choosing alternate paths, illuminating empty spaces. Retaliation followed swiftly. A message turned up on my steps at twilight, penned in neat capitals, cautioning against probing unfamiliar lanes. On another occasion, a rap came right after sunset, informing me my rear casement had been ajar that afternoon, despite my presence indoors the entire time. Reporting the slips of paper and drop-ins to officials once more yielded a courteous yet resolute dismissal. New arrivals frequently mistook neighborly interest for intrusion, they noted, and agitating matters wouldn't ease my integration. The implication hung unspoken: conform or face consequences. Next, seclusion settled in, thick and intentional. Calls cut off without warning. Web connections faltered often. Service calls for fixes dragged on inexplicably. Mail ceased arriving for a period, even as I watched the postal van roll past. With every evening, the dwelling shrank, as if the structure conspired with the settlement to squeeze tighter. It dawned on me that departure wasn't merely frowned upon. It was anticipated for those unwilling to conform. Strangers didn't disrupt the local cadence. They synced with it or faded away. For the first time upon settling in, I grasped that the property wasn't my legacy. It served as the trial. The pivotal shift occurred toward evening after a trip for provisions, when I discovered the entry unbolted. I lingered there too long, fixated on the knob, mentally retracing my motions prior to departure. At a cursory look, the interior appeared untouched, yet the space bore that odd fragrance anew, more potent than before. A neatly folded sheet lay on the kitchen table, something I was certain hadn't been there moments ago. It held no overt menace. Instead, it just noted my typical comings and goings, the moments when the lights clicked off. Down at the end, one line stood out in tinier script, suggesting that everything flows better when folks stick to the established routine. I skipped involving the police this time around. Rather, I grabbed a single bag with essentials I could manage on my own: outfits, paperwork, my computer, and a handful of belongings that truly seemed personal. As evening shadows deepened, vehicles crept by my home at a crawl, their beams pausing on the panes. A single rap echoed at the door, steady without haste, before the visitor retreated after my silence. I remained motionless on the living room rug, breaths light, ears tuned to the slow patrol of steps around the perimeter, never accelerating. It wasn't terror holding me down. It was a sharp realization. This spot didn't pose the kind of threat folks imagine. It was methodical, and I didn't fit into its framework. Once darkness blanketed everything, I eased out the rear exit, cutting through the meadows rather than the front path. The ground undulated in irregular swells, drenching my footwear in moisture. From afar, I picked up the rumble of motors firing up, slams of car doors, yet no yells or pursuit followed. That wasn't necessary. When I hit the highway at last, my muscles ached fiercely, and my cell showed no bars. At least the quiet now rang hollow, free of that constant scrutiny. Hours on, I waved down a truck rumbling past and kept my story brief, mentioning only the urgency of getting distant. The man behind the wheel pressed for nothing more. He had no reason to. I left the bulk of my possessions behind for good. Some weeks after, an envelope arrived redirected to my stopgap spot, holding the home keys and a brief message expressing gratitude for grasping the local ways. No sender details, no name attached. I offloaded the house site unseen, settling for a sum well below market, and viewed it as an even exchange. Even now, old patterns linger in my mind. I scan for habits instinctively, peer out pains repeatedly, strain to hear too much. I steer clear of mentioning that settlement in conversation, but one truth sticks with me. Not every locale seeks your injury. They merely crave your conformity.